To get to talk about this amazingly capacious book, a book that is capacious both chronologically and geographically. It spans much of the 19th century. It takes us, among other places, into New York City's Bowery neighborhood, imagined antebellum plantations, onto Civil War battlefields, into Andersonville prison camp, and George Washington's Mount Vernon. Along the way, we spend time with Walt Whitman, Henry James, and James Henry Hammond, Abraham Lincoln, Mark Twain, James Buchanan, Charles and Henry Adams, Anthony Comstock, William Faulkner, Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens, Herman Melville, Charles Sumner, the Dunning School historians, and many, many others. So it strikes me that one of the really capacious things about this book is your term same-sex romance. So talk to me a little bit about what you mean when you talk about same-sex romance, what all that encompasses.
Sure. Thank you, Annie, for being here. Thank you all for being here as well. It means a lot to see so many familiar faces here and so many people I haven't seen in a while. So thank you all. Yeah, same-sex romance is obviously in the title of the book. And what I want to do by using that term is try to have something that stretches from male friendship, the fellowship that's really important. Even in the founding era of the United States, we know that male friendship is an important term for people in the Revolutionary era, for people in the era of the US founding, all the way to the homosexuality of the 20th century. And so part of the reason to do same-sex romance is to try to have that sweep. What I'm interested in this book is the depictions of relationships between men, depictions of relationships between men in novels, in films, in other forms of culture, and what they mean politically, what the political meaning is of those depictions there. I think there's probably plenty more I could say as I walk through the book's argument, but I'll say that one of the things that I'm interested in, why that's an important term for the period, is we've got to imagine a period of the 19th century when we have an all-male franchise. It's exclusively a male franchise in the early part of the United States up until 1920. So in that period, relationships between men are a potent political symbol. They're a potent political symbol for that universal male suffrage, and they're a potent political symbol for the political affiliations between men. So I want to try to trace that from the early founding period all the way through the 20th century as well.
So I think you kind of tipped my hand to something that maybe folks wouldn't necessarily think of when they just saw your title, which is this book has a lot to say about 19th century American politics. And this starts in the very first chapter when you're interested in tracing these same-sex friendships and their depiction, and in particular their importance to the Democratic Party. Why the Democratic Party? Why not the Republican Party? What do we learn about the Democratic Party from kind of studying these relationships?
Yeah, one thing I probably should have said in that first answer is that a lot of the depictions we get in literature are going to be explicitly homoerotic as well. And so central to this depiction, whether it's of intimate male friendship all the way through proper homosexuality, is an eroticized interest in these relationships between men. Democratic Party in the period, what I find strange, what I think we have to find strange, you know this well, about the Democratic Party in the early 19th century is that there are really two poles to that party. There is an urban pole in places like New York City in which there are working class white voters, and there is a southern pole of that party in which it is southern slaveholders. And I think that history is the history of the United States, but it has to look to us somewhat curious now that that's the alliance and the partnership that forms between urban white workers and southern slaveholders. And I think that what holds that together in this period is symbolism about male affection and male affiliation. So if we look at New York City in this period, as you said, we look in the Bowery neighborhood, is a neighborhood in that time that is notorious somewhat for its expansive sexuality and for same-sex relationships between men. It's explicitly tied to the Democratic Party in that period. And so I look at political figures like Michael Walsh, who is an urban Democrat, a pro-slavery Democrat from New York City, who organizes around the idea of his friendships. Part of friendship with Michael Walsh is crucial to his political organization in New York City. At the same time, the party as a whole is united by images of male friendship. And so one of the things that I find really curious about the Democratic Party in the period is how compromise gets symbolized through male friendship. Now, the Democratic Party is the party of compromise in the 19th century because it is the party of compromises over slavery. And so one of the figures that I look at is James Buchanan. James Buchanan is the 15th president of the United States, who has a famous, intimate friendship with the previous vice president, William Rufus King. Today, people look at that relationship between the two, and there are suggestions of a sexual relationship between the two of them. There's even a kind of erroneous claim about the two that King served as in spousal duties for Buchanan's White House. Of course, that's not true because King died before Buchanan became president. But the relationship between those two men is important, and it's publicized. It's not a secret in the period. I'm saying a lot of things at once here. To tie all the pieces together. Buchanan is from Pennsylvania. He's a pro-slavery Northerner. William Rufus King is from Alabama. He is a slaveholder himself. Therefore, what that relationship between the two of them symbolizes to the public is the relationship between white Northerners and white Southerners. And so that political partnership, that intimate friendship, becomes a symbol for how the parties united in defense of slavery across the North and the South.
And this really differs from what's going on in the Republican Party at the time.
Differs from what's going on in the Republican Party at the time. Republican Party really gets its first moments of founding in '56 with the Fremont campaign, but of course Abraham Lincoln is the central figure of the emerging Republican Party who wins election in 1860. We talk a lot today about Lincoln's friendships with other men. We talk in particular about Lincoln's friendship with Joshua Speed, a Kentucky slaveholder. Those friendships are not a part of the public campaign relative to Lincoln's 1860 election. Instead, the Republican Party wants to present Lincoln as a self-made man, as someone who is not reliant on friends, not reliant on associates who helped him advance through life. So it is, I'm looking at a room of historians here, and I'm not saying anything new about the differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the period, the Republican Party being one that is embracing this idea of self-made individualism, the Democratic Party that's embracing unity between white Northerners and white Southerners as part of pro-slavery politics. What I'm adding to that conversation is that the notions of male intimacy and male friendship are part of those politics. So Lincoln's campaign is running in repudiation, in many ways, of the kind of compromise politics that Buchanan and King symbolize, the kind of compromise politics of the Democratic Party. That said, Lincoln does famously use his inaugural address to talk about the bonds of affection. And at that moment, Lincoln begins to co-opt some of the language of the Democratic Party. And of course, as we move forward after Lincoln's death, he becomes a symbol of that cross-sectional friendship. And I could say more about that.
Like any good politician, he co-opts the messages of his opponents and turns them to his own purposes and devices. So you start off by talking about the symbol of male friendship in the antebellum era, and then you return towards the end of the book to think through party politics and specifically the rise of a group called the Mugwumps, a faction that was within the Republican Party that ends up supporting the Democrat Grover Cleveland in 1884 because they think that their own party's candidate, James Blaine, is hopelessly corrupt. And so they've got to cross party lines in order to advance the other candidate. So how does same-sex romance, the same concept that is explaining something about the Democratic Party in the antebellum era, how does that same concept help us understand kind of the rise of the Mugwumps, the rise of kind of liberal Republicans?
Yeah, that's a good question. The liberal Republicans are central to the story. White Northerners, really, who we're describing, oftentimes elite white Northerners who are the people before the Civil War who are oftentimes abolitionists. So one figure to look at as an example of a Mugwump, though not often associated with Mugwumpism, is Walt Whitman. Mm-hmm. Walt Whitman, a radical racial egalitarian in Leaves of Grass, a supporter of the Lincoln campaign, is someone who, after the war, wants to see reconciliation between Northerners and Southerners. And part of the way the book opens is with Whitman's poetry that matches the descriptions of relationships between men, former Confederate soldiers with former Union soldiers, as that symbol of reunion. So Whitman is an example of someone whose politics really transform across this period, who transforms from someone who is radically oriented towards emancipation and the Lincoln Republican Party, and then by 1884 he's a McGuump voter, as you said. Twain is another example of someone who is a McGuump voter as well. What I want to trace in this book is that cultural history, the cultural history of elite white Northerners who begin to feel more sympathetic towards white Southerners over the course of Reconstruction. There are any number of possible explanations for the McGuump movement, the liberal Republican movement. Oftentimes, people will put those explanations explicitly in terms of race, that the sympathies for enslaved people are not sympathies for black people generally, and so by the time we get to the 1880s, the elite white Northerners who were supportive of abolition are no longer supportive of black citizenship and black empowerment. Another explanation of the McGuump movement is specifically economic, that the end of slavery, the Civil War, is not, to the view of elite white Northerners, necessarily in contrast to their economic interests. But by the time we get to the 1880s, they see redistributionary policies, they see black economic empowerment as something that is goes against their interests, right? So any number of these explanations are possible for the McGuump movement, among others. What I'm trying to do in the book is tell the story of culture and what's the cultural story that goes alongside this. So though we may have economic or racial anxieties, how does that manifest in culture? The figure at the end of the book that I trace in that chapter is Henry James. Henry James, the novelist, American novelist, British novelist as well, as he leaves for England. Someone who really is resistant to politics, who believes in promoting a virtuous culture over vulgar politics. I think we can understand that Jamesian motivation today. You can feel that today of why you'd want to promote a virtuous culture over a kind of vulgar politics. But in James's case, it really does come to some sympathies for white Southerners. Two places where that appears is James's fantastic novel. No disparagement to James's novel. It should be read despite the criticisms here. His 1886 novel, The Bostonians, which narrates a white woman from Cambridge, Massachusetts, who really leaves her Bostonian companion in order to be with a Confederate veteran. That's the trajectory of The Bostonians that James, of course, does in complicated ways. And then there's a moment in James's The American Scene in which he's talking about his visit to Richmond. And in his visit to Richmond, he comes across the son of a former Confederate soldier. And James has this real moment that seems a moment of attraction to this Confederate soldier. And one of the things that he really admires about this Confederate soldier is his belief, his ingenuousness is an important term there, and his antipathy to vulgar partisanship and northern industrial capitalism. And so for James, what he likes about this young Southern man is that young Southern man is standing in opposition to what he sees as the contemporary politics. So I map all of that onto the McGuump election, which is where this question started and what you asked about here, that what James wants to see is a response to what he sees as the corrupt commercialism of his present. He, like many other McGuump-type figures in the period, find that in young white Southern men, especially as sort of symbols and avatars of what stands in resistance to industrial capitalism.
So I think one of the things that's so interesting and exciting here, and you talk about this in the introduction, you write that your work challenges the presumption of queerness's radical potential. So I want you to talk about that presumption, why we have that presumption. And then I think really what you're kind of tracing over the course of this book obviously so far we've talked about political kind of conservatism. I think, let's save plenty of time to talk about other kind of forms of conservatism that emerge here in the book. But talk to me about the ways in which same-sex romance is motivating actually conservative movements and tendencies across the 19th century.
Yeah, you're asking such great questions that get to the heart of the book, which is my defense of the wide-ranging answers that try to touch on everything here. Yeah, I think that same-sex romance in the 19th century has fundamentally some conservative tendencies. One reason for that is if we think about the lives of 19th century people, they're highly gender-segregated lives. And for 19th century men, one of the social dangers that exists are the social dangers associated with women. The dangers of prostitution, the dangers of relationships before marriage, that intimate male friendship, however much it may cross a line we see today of sexuality, is seen as a kind of conservative protection against those other social dangers. It's what enables this to be a kind of conservative symbolism, that protection. So that's where I get the sense of the Democratic Party and its conservatism relies on this symbolism there. But I'll give one example of the conservatism that I sort of pinpoint in the book is in the antebellum period in the writings that responds to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, the 1851 novel that is the best-selling novel of the 19th century, an anti-slavery novel, a novel that aims to depict the evils of slavery, given its political success and its publishing success, it spawns a huge number of responses. And so one of the things I did in researching the book is look at those responses, look at the variety of responses to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And one of the things that is a feature of those responses is depictions of relationships between enslaved men and slaveholders. So enslaved black men and white slaveholders are rendered in those novels in the kind of sympathetic language that we see otherwise with romantic friendship and male intimacy. And there's a way that they get analogized to marriage. And there's an argument that these novels are making, which is that slavery as an institution is as natural and permanent in their imagination as marriage is. So they narrate this relationship, that it's a relationship of enslaver and enslaved, as one that is analogous to something as sanctified as marriage. So to me, that's a fundamentally conservative view of male-male romance. And when you see in these novels sort of a depiction of an enslaver and an enslaved man doing something that looks today like gay marriage, we can see that what seems to us potential as like a queer potential in the 20th century or the 21st century actually has some fundamentally conservative impulses, or is used for conservative purposes in the 19th century.
I'm so glad that you talked about this collection of novels. You refer to them in your book as anti-Tom novels, and it's a collection of novels that even as a slavery scholar, I didn't know about, and I found them fascinating. Because one of the things
fascinating enough to read them. I would not.
Fair. I don't necessarily get the sense that they're great literature.
They're not recommended here. I read them, so you all don't have to.
Doing the Lord's work.
Yeah.
So in chapter 3, you also spend a lot of time talking about, the chapter is titled Pretty Young Dead Confederates, who come to sort of symbolize an innocent Confederacy killed in the bloom of youth for a lot of sort of subsequent observers. And reading about these boy soldiers, of course, as someone who worked at the University of Mississippi for so many years, I couldn't not think about the University Grays, the Mississippi Infantry Company that consisted almost entirely of University of Mississippi students who participate in Pickett's charge that Faulkner so famously talks about. They suffer 100% casualties at Pickett's charge. And these pretty young dead Confederates do such important symbolic work, I think, in your book. But I wonder if, and this is very much the kind of social historian impulse in me, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how these kind of these fantasies about who these young men were and the kinds of relationships that they have are belied, I think, by a lot of the reality. Because I will also say, if you know much about the University of Mississippi's early history, you know that many chancellors basically quit because it turned out that these slaveholding young men were virtually ungovernable. And a lot of people who chronicled them have, I think, kind of excused a lot of the behaviors, maybe immature, but ultimately pretty harmless. When you actually read about their conduct, especially their conduct in relation to enslaved workers on campus, it's pretty horrifying, brutal stuff. So I may be interested in having you think a little bit about the kind of reality of being a kind of scion of a slaveholding family, as many of these pretty young dead Confederates in fact were, and the need to, or the attempt to turn them into these symbols of innocence and really kind of purity, to serve this kind of nostalgic factor, to do this kind of nostalgic work in the years after the Civil War.
Yeah, I think we could talk at length about the University Greys, who of course feature in Faulkner's Intruder in the Dust, which I'll come back to here in Faulkner country. We'll come back to Intruder in the Dust. After the Civil War, given the large-scale death of Confederate soldiers, we shouldn't be surprised to see that soldiers are memorialized, the dead are memorialized. One of the things that I'm thinking about in that chapter is the particular ways that the dead are memorialized, the particular dead that are chosen to be memorialized, and what those cultural narratives mean. And so after the Civil War, we see really even a little bit during the Civil War, during the end of the war, and then after the Civil War, we see attention on, as you said, or you said saying what I said, these young dead Confederate soldiers, these men who are celebrated as exceptional for their youth, their purity, their white-coated purity and beauty, and the descriptions are pretty explicit about the relationship between them and the older veterans that they serve with. The primary example that I look at is not a Mississippi soldier, but an Alabama soldier, John Pelham. And John Pelham is that scion of slavery in many ways. He's in Stuart's cavalry, and after he dies at Kelly's Ford in 1863. After he dies, there are effusive descriptions of what Pelham was like. Pelham gets celebrated as that gallant lion by Robert E. Lee. He's celebrated by Jeb Stuart in particular, who's described as crying over the body of Pelham there and names his daughter after Pelham. But Pelham gets described as feminized in these descriptions. Pelham is a West Point soldier. In his time at West Point, he's notorious for being nicknamed Sally, for being the best dance partner with the other boys. And so part of the Pelham mystique is about this beautiful boy who died too young. And so what I want to look at in this chapter is the way that after the Civil War, figures like Pelham become a crucial symbol for how the failed nation of the Confederacy wants to remember itself, as cut down in the prime of life, as this youthful, innocent figure. And to move forward in time, I think the description of comparing Pelham to the reality of these men's lives is really important. Pelham is described as a boy soldier. He's 23 at the time that he dies, so he's young, but he's not as young as the 14-year-old Pelham statue that is in Jacksonville, Alabama now. But part of that youth and innocence is serving a political function and a propagandistic function. It's to make these young Confederates innocent, right? For Pelham, I'm sort of following some theorists who are thinking about a notion of a kind of eroticized innocence of these young men, which is true in the Pelham description, but it's a way of exonerating Pelham from the problems of the Confederacy, from his relationship to slavery. And one of the things about Pelham and other boy soldiers is that their statues tend to stay up today. That as we've had a wave of Confederate statues being removed, it's the statues of these young boys, these so-called boy soldiers, that remain, with the argument that, well, they weren't the leaders of the Confederacy, they weren't in charge of this, they weren't the primary slaveholders who secede, they're just the innocent soldiers whose death is a tragedy in the war. And of course, I think, not to get into a debate about Confederate statues and their taking down, as we have one here that needs to be taken down, that it sort of mistakes what we're talking about here, and not the guilt or innocence of any one person, but the Confederacy in general and what it stood for. So to come back to Faulkner, Faulkner has this moment in Intruder in the Dust, in which the famous moment that everybody who likes the Civil War quotes, and of course Shelby Foote quotes it at length in the Civil War documentary, the moment of Chick Mallison is being told by his uncle about how every Confederate, someone here is going to be able to do this better than I am. I'm almost embarrassed to try to do the Faulkner line without having it verbatim here, but that every 14-year-old boy always has that moment at not before 2:30 on the 3rd day of July at the Battle of Gettysburg, as if what is available to white Southern youth is this perpetual innocence of boyhood, that the Confederate Army, the Confederate project, stands there in Faulkner's imagination as this perpetual youthfulness that any white Southerner can return to. Now, people quote that all the time from Faulkner, missing that Faulkner's critical in this moment of that kind of retreat from reality. Faulkner is writing a novel that is about a political trial in which a black man is accused of crime, and what Faulkner is critical of is the idea that people like Chick Mallison and his uncle Gavin Stevens can retreat from reality to this ideal world of the Confederacy. All of that is to say that I think in my work, it's attention to the cultural narratives around these pretty young dead Confederates, like Pelham, that is trying to puncture that reality. And I equally admire the work of universities who are doing that kind of puncturing of the university's ideal history with the realities of what slavery was like here on this nearby campus.
So I'm going to ask one last question because I want to make sure that we've got enough time for our audience here to ask their own questions. But everything that you're narrating sort of across the 19th century is happening against a kind of background of the evolution, the development of homosexuality as a discrete sexuality, as an identity. Talk to me about how that shapes the perception of these same-sex romances, these friendships, and how they come to be seen so differently towards the end of the 19th century as that homosexual identity is really kind of starting to come into view.
Yeah. We maybe should have started there with the same-sex romance question now that I think about it. That one crucial story here that I'm trying, I'll step back and say the two things that this book is trying to do is, number one, explore the cultural history of politics in the late 19th century and think about things like the Mi'kmaq movement and the relationship between U.S. culture and the period of Reconstruction. The other thing that this book is trying to do is bring in the history of sexuality in the period. That history is one that's typically thought of with a sort of shorthand of the birth of sexuality, the idea that over the course of the 19th century, sexuality's conception transformed from something that is much more like acts, the things people do, into something that's much more like identities, who you are. That transformation really takes hold in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s. And so one of the phenomena that my book looks at is the rise of sexual science, the rise of a racialized sexual science, in which in the period about 2 decades after the Civil War, and for reasons I get into in the book that's connected to the Civil War itself, there's a scientific effort to explain deviant sexual types. And parts of those explanation rely in turn on those sexual scientists' understanding of history. And so for sexual scientists writing in the 1880s and 1890s, they begin to associate what they see as the rise of the problem of homosexuality as connected to the recent historical developments. They see the rise of homosexuality, the rise of deviant sexuality, as tied to 19th century transformations like urbanization and like emancipation as well, the transformations that happen after and as a result of the Civil War. after the sexual scientists begin writing this, they in turn inform the historians. So one of the groups of historians that I examine is the Dunning School of historians who are writing in conversation with those sexual scientists. Dunning School, as folks I think in this room probably know well, William Archibald Dunning, the Columbia historian, who wants to write the history of Reconstruction as national political development. He believes that the result of Reconstruction is the rise of the American nation state. He is skeptical of Reconstruction's aims for Black empowerment, but he actually stopped short of nostalgizing and romanticizing plantation slavery. It's his students who often do a lot of that work of romanticizing the antebellum period. They're drawing on these same binary terms as the sexual scientists of a move from an agrarian culture to an urbanized culture, a move from the rural to the city, a move from pre-modernity to modernization, a move from slavery to emancipation that in turn is drawing on the sexual scientists of the period. So one of the things that what the book's always trying to do is situate historical interpretation within the history of sexuality, but in this particular moment, it's situating the Dunning School historians and other historians of the period, like James Ford Rhodes, who comes before it, within the conceptions of the history of sexuality, because these university employees are all having similar conversations and are interacting with each other and drawing on each other's sources and resources there in arguments.
Well, and one of the most amazing things is it also situates them in New York City. So much has been made of the fact that so many of Dunning's students came from these sort of small southern towns. I think that's probably like the story that we're familiar with. But what you do is like you start to think through, they're living on the Upper West Side in proximity to Harlem, which has then at that point become a neighborhood sort of associated with potentially deviant sexual acts. And so it's like they're experiencing in their own lives, I think, something that then maybe plays out in their writing.
Yeah, I gave a talk right before this, and I had something about that in that, and now I'm like, that's the one part of the book that I'm like, I need to like narrow down more. I like need to make that claim more forceful. But it is the case that they're all living around Columbia University, on the border of Harlem, right, at this moment that Harlem is beginning to be described in the terms of the Harlem Renaissance that we know, but also in the terms of George Chauncey's Gay New York, right, as well. I don't want to be too tendentious about that claim, but I am trying to situate the real lives of these historians. But James Garner, who's the Mississippi historian, has this moment where he says that as freed people in the 1860s and 1870s are moving from rural Delta counties into Vicksburg, he has this moment where he says where they must suffer from idleness, vice, and disease. And to me, that is drawing on these same kind of notion that, to me, that is linked to his experience of having moved from Summit, Mississippi to Columbia, that the poles for him are country and city, right? And so what I want to think about is what's the story of sexuality in those poles of country and city?
There is so much in this book, and I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. So I want to turn it over to the audience to ask Andy anything that they might be curious about in relation to same-sex romance across the 19th century. Sure, Sheila.
I need to read this book.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, you talk about the way that the South memorialized these young men. Did the North do that? I mean, surely young men in the North died too. Did they do that? And if they didn't, why not?
Yeah, that's a great question. Immediately, yes. There's an analog to John Pelham, which is Elmer Ellsworth, who also dies young, dies as reputed to be among the first deaths on the Union side. And part of the Ellsworth story is his handsomeness and his beauty and what he looks like. Another part of that story is his friendship with Abraham Lincoln as well. And I think that I don't want to give the unequivocal answer of no, that there aren't similar stories, right? Of course you're right that in the North, there are going to be similar young men who are dead. In the North, there are other stories, though, that supplement that at the very least. Stories of the Grand Army of the Republic, which is the veterans organization that mobilizes politically. There's additionally the story of Lincoln himself, and I do think that Lincoln begins to take over in many ways the story of the dead. One difference may be in Drew Faust's Republic of Suffering. The way she attends a little bit to this difference and talks about La Tennée and the painting of William La Tennée, a Confederate soldier who dies, of which there's a famous painting. And she talks about kind of the massive organization of northern cemeteries as well. And so I think in the North, the problems are of scale and bureaucracy in a way that in the South, they become tied to these individuals. But I want to think more about that question. It's a really good one to think through. And I guess up to this point, I haven't seen examples other than the early example of Ellsworth that I would find being directly comparable to the way that Pelham's cut down in the prime of life seems to serve as a national symbol. Other questions? Brooke, you're going to tell me the white northern soldiers who died who are in fact not Pelham.
I'm going to, Carolyn, in your title you have Confederate Sympathies, same-sex romance, disunion, and reunion in the Civil War era. And of course, reunion takes on a whole lot of connotations. David Blight, race and reunion. But Carolyn Janey, in responding to Blight's book, points out there's an important difference between reunion and reconciliation. And I'm going to push you a little bit on that difference. Reconciliation, you can, in other words, reunion is a political. It was a political. What Janey stresses is reconciliation was a sense of sympathies. Reunion was a political mode. You had to reunite the country. But I'm going to push that even further. Reunion also has like a class reunion. There is a sense of intimacy in reunion. And while reconciliation, you can have sympathy, but not union. So I'm just wondering if there's a difference in terms of these male sympathies, the sympathies with the South, and a homoerotic reunion with the South.
Yeah, I mean it's a well-received push here that I'm sympathetic myself to these distinctions and Janey's distinction between reconciliation and reunion. I mean, I guess I'll admit to you here and in public that I've fudged a little bit of that difference in the book for a few reasons, right? As you know well, that one of the primary stories we have in cultural history coming out of the Civil War or in the period of Reconstruction is the kind of romance of a reunion story. The Nina Silber book, in which her argument is a gendered argument that in a lot of stories that happen after the Civil War, we've got white northern men and southern women, and what the white northern men need to do is subdue these white southern women into a reunion, which she's playing on the marital title of reunion there. And there's the reverse stories, and as you write about in any number of possible stories that involve this kind of gendered image of marriage. So one thing that I want to do, that the book is trying to do, is build upon the Nina Silber argument and say that if we have these stories in cultural history of heterosexual unions that make political meaning, that I want to insist upon these same-sex romance stories that make political meaning. I can give a few more examples on why to choose that may be semantic, right, and why choosing this as the title. But on the specific difference between reconciliation and reunion, Whitman's poem that I cited at the beginning, that poem in which Whitman imagines a dead Confederate soldier and he's kissing the lips of the dead Confederate soldier, is called Reconciliation, right? That is a story of reconciliation. I want to lean towards reunion partly because of the Nina Silber argument and because of the marital connotations as well. One thing that we didn't really talk about here is the set of novels that are the novels of the disunion part of the story, which are novels in which two young white men, oftentimes one from the North and one from the South, are best friends, intimate friends. They're described in college as being in love with each other, a love surpassing the love of women, like Jonathan and David. And then the Civil War happens and they break up. And oftentimes across the Civil War, one dies and one lives. And so part of what I'm narrating in response to Silber is these stories of disunion. Now, with those stories of disunion, because they end with the death of one soldier and the marital prospects usually of the other, what I see there is not a reconciliation, right? Reconciliation would be the wrong way to describe that. Nonetheless, I want to think about that in terms of reunion, even though one man is dead, because there's something symbolic about what's happening there that is about the symbolism of union and reunion there. An unsatisfactory answer for you for the push.
But I think too the conservative ends that you talk about, sort of the ways in which it's then those relationships get treated as a kind of immature state. That the romantic friendship was confined to sort of their youth, and in order to progress to adulthood, they had to leave those behind, and maybe they left those behind not through choice because one of them died. But in any case, that becomes a kind of concept, kind of way of thinking about those relationships as confined to a certain life phase that they didn't in the antebellum period necessarily need to be confined to.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
This is not about Civil War historiography.
Yeah, let's do it.
I was interested in what I think you kind of gestured to a little bit when you were talking about Lincoln and how they were not using this image of friendship in the Republican Party, but the idea of sort of like the darker side of friendship, like friendship as sort of having connections that you can draw on, or friendship as alliances that are maybe tying you in ways that can be problematic, and how that shows up, if it shows up at all.
Yeah, that's a great question that is worth thinking through. I mean, immediately I'm thinking about how in what I'm looking at, friendship in the late 19th century appears to be a virtue and a nostalgic virtue of the past. That when you have someone like Henry Adams in the late 19th century, thinking of Henry Adams, the historian, folks know well, the novelist of a book called Democracy as well. Henry Adams, also the grandson of John Quincy Adams and the great-grandson of John Adams. When he's thinking about friendship, he's thinking about the fact that his father, his grandfather and his great-grandfather formed these friendships across sectional lines and this notion, looking back at the early founding of America, that says that partisanship, sectionalism, slavery did not get in the way of these kind of virtuous friendships. Now, with your question, I want to think more about it, because what's curious is that in this moment in which the political discourse is about political and public corruption, one might expect to see the darker side of friendship in that period. That one could see James Blaine, in particular, the Republican candidate who runs against Grover Cleveland in '84, as being someone who is described as having these dark and nefarious friends who are paying him off. And I'm going to say in this that I don't think I see a lot of examples of that darker side of friendship in this moment when you might expect it. Instead, friendship becomes, especially in contrast to the kind of darker side of friendship of being paid off, of bribery, friendship becomes a real virtue there. Now, that said, friendship, I think, is a virtue even when what we're describing as a maybe darker side of the story with compromises over slavery in the antebellum period. But friendship is a valorized notion then. What's interesting is of course, many historians have written about, and cultural historians as well, have written about corruption as a through line, the changing notions of corruption as a through line in American history. though it changes over time, Americans in this representative democracy are especially concerned with corruption as a concept and as a term. I think friendship, for most of what I've seen, serves as a valorized counterpoint to corruption. It may not be true today. We think of friends. You have good friends and bad friends, I guess, today. Yeah. I got to think more about that, Alex.
So
Dee.
I have a kind of a really unfair question, but it's also kind of like a question that I just want you to kind of think back to maybe when you were first starting to write this book and what your thinking was. So obviously, the concept of innocent male friendship, eroticized male friendship, a friendship that is of a certain phase of life, but then you grow out of it and you mature and you marry, etc. That's been available for centuries, and it's still available, and it's available in Great Britain and Europe and all the other places, right? So the idea is that for whatever reason, in this particular moment, that got kind of vacuumed up by this particular ideological structure that used it in a particular way, right? I guess my question is, when you were sitting down to first write this book, what were you thinking in terms of why that formation got used in this particular way by a conservative democratic Southern alliance, rather than by, we could imagine another story in which that kind of romanticized male friendship gets taken up as an ideological banner for the Northern story. So I guess, do you have an answer for that? I mean, that's what I mean by being unfair. I'm sure you've thought about it, but do you have an answer for why it seemed to fit or be taken up by this particular structure rather than another one?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's an unfair question. It may be an exceptionally fair one because for whatever reason it gives me a reason to talk about Frederick Jameson, I guess, is the
Awesome.
that I don't think this is a pushback on your question at all. But my sense of literary history, right, is that these kinds of cultural forms that we think about are take on particular historical meanings in their moments. So it's not the case that this is an otherwise valorized phenomenon that only in this period gets vacuumed up. It's that things like romance, of course, so many of the novels we read are about romance, right? Things that are like male development and male friendship are pretty recurrent themes in literature. And one of the things that I do, and I know that you do as well as a literary historian, is to figure out what the particular historical resonances and meaning are of that in its particular moment. I think that that's one of the things that literature does to us as an archive of history, is it gives us a way of thinking through ideology and epistemology in its particular moment, right? So then why is it that this form gets subsumed in these conservative notions in the moment? I think I have a couple different answers on that. One is the long-standing tradition in American politics of seeing male friendship as a conservative force. And I think that does come back to the all-male franchise. One of the things that's happening, and one of the reasons to use the word reunion, though I guess reconciliation could also work for this, is that there's a looking backward that happens in this period. So when Whitman is writing in the 1850s about how the affections between men are going to save politics, he's thinking about the Revolutionary era. When Whitman is writing after the Civil War about how male intimacy is going to save us from politics, he's thinking about the 1850s, the period right before the Civil War. So part of it is the looking backward that happens. Now, in terms of the alternative stories, I think me as a 20th century born person who's living in the 21st century, my anticipation when I started reading especially the pro-slavery novels was that I was going to see what things that looked like a kind of homophobic language being deployed as political attack. That's one of the things that we might expect from the 20th century, that where notions of sexuality are going to appear in politics, they're going to be a form of political attack. And I think I was quite surprised to find none of that there. And the advice that I got, this initially started as a dissertation project, and the advice that I got was to just read as much as I possibly could and try to keep track of patterns. And I think there was a moment when I was reading The Thinking Bayonet, which is one of the novels that I talk about, that I found it pretty remarkable that it had this story of male-male disunion. And then there was another one, and another one after that, and another one after that. And then late in the process, I was like, oh, well, I never read this book, The Norwich Cadets. I should probably read and see what the Norwich Cadets is all about. And of course, my jaw dropped that it's like I could have written this story because it so fit the pattern that I was describing already, with a few deviations that I do think it was surprising to see. And I think from our vantage point today, it is surprising to see things like homoeroticism and same-sex intimacies being usable for conservative and reactionary politics. Though maybe that's not that surprising in our particular moment. Yes, Scott.
It's a follow-up question. Do you have any thoughts about Walter Scott? Mark Twain, here's that line about Walter Scott being responsible more than any other figure for the Civil War. Generally, we understand that he means that Walter Scott portrays a certain sort of notion of nobility, right? A kind of old order that is, admirable. But Walter Scott's narratives also always tend to represent a young man, naive young man, falling into the sway of a charismatic old order figure, right? Who's sort of, it's almost a seduction, right? And then for a time, is sort of carried along by that intimacy and that admiration, and of course it's spilled out at the end. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about Walter Scott in particular in relationship to these topics.
Thoughts about Walter Scott. Do I? In literary history, we think of Walter Scott as one of the inventors of the historical novel, and that what Walter Scott does is place ordinary people in transformational historical times. That's sort of what he's known as, especially in the Lukács argument about Walter Scott. I think a lot of the novels that I'm working with and thinking about are in that sense of a Walter Scott historical romance, right? And there's a book that's out by another literary historian now that's called America's Imagined Revolution, I believe, that is thinking about Reconstruction as a field for historical novels. A lot of the novels that I'm looking at have overlap with that. I think that would be my short answer. I don't totally subscribe to Twain's notion that Walter Scott is the cause of the Civil War. Nonetheless, it is the case that a lot of the kind of medievalism that is celebrated in the South is Walter Scott derived. And I do think that a lot of that medievalism also has a Venn diagram circle with the homoeroticism that I'm describing as well. So there's a sense that what Twain's describing, the medievalism and the homoeroticism, is there. Tyson Pugh has a book on this called, I should have just said Tyson Pugh has a book on this, that's about Twain in particular, and Connecticut Yankee is that kind of Twain undoing that medievalism. But the thing that I'd say is the strongest influence of Walter Scott is the sense that with literature, what we're doing is thinking about grand historical narratives with the personal lives of individual people. And this is one thing that we do as literary critics, is take a story that's about a man falling in love with a woman, a woman falling in love with a man falling in love with a man and breaking up. And we say, what's the political ideology that serves as the contextual background for this story? That is a kind of reading that comes out of Walter Scott. And it's a kind of reading that we do, and that I certainly do, that leads to the line, I'll just say it because again we're here at Square Books, in Faulkner, where in Absalom, where he's talking about Quentin and Shreve as well as Henry and Bond, and he says that they weren't the only two young men who thought that wars existed just for the solutions of their personal problems. I don't have that exactly right, the second Faulkner misquote of the night. But that notion of what literature does is think through big historical change in terms of personal relationships and how we read it. That seems to me to be the legacy of Scott in America. Yeah.
Did you come across any narratives of black male relationships?
That are intraracial?
No.
Not in this narrative, right? One of the things I do discuss is that relationship between white and black men. I think that it is the case that this is telling just one story of memories of homoeroticism after the Civil War. There's any number of interpretations of Reconstruction. There's any number of interpretations of the Civil War, and there's also any number of experiences of homoeroticism that have political resonances. We could imagine some of those, right? And recent novelists have actually done a little bit of work of doing that imagination. So there are a few recent novels, one by, it's around here, I'm sure we could pick it up now. Robert Jones Jr., that's exactly what I was thinking, The Prophet, that imagines how the relationships between enslaved men may serve as a kind of resistance to slavery. We could also imagine how the experience of the Union Army is a homosocial experience. And so if you're imagining the experience of black soldiers who have left plantation slavery, who have escaped plantation slavery with all of its abuses and violences and sexual abuses, are finding their first moments of freedom in homosocial camp life, we could imagine that to be a resonant place for political meaning of these kinds of homosocial stories. And we could equally imagine stories after the Civil War as well about affiliations between black men. I think the reason why I keep saying we could imagine it is because right now it's the novelists who do a lot of that work due to perhaps archival absences. The one thing that I'll say about why this story is told the way that it is that it's not the case that there really are, while there may be any number of possible interpretations, the one that I'm looking at is one that is tied into a national memory and national trajectory. So one of the reasons to look at these elite white liberals as the producers of culture is because they're the ones who are doing a lot of dominant storytelling in the period, but they're also tapping into a larger story of American identity, one that goes back to the sense of romantic friendship as a virtue at the time of the founding. So the short answer is no, I haven't seen those, but I'm sure that they both exist and may be findable in archival sources. We may need better tools for reading them.
I wanted to ask one kind of follow-up question
Yeah.
to something that you mentioned already, which is if you don't find contemporaries wielding accusations of what we would today call homosexual behavior as a kind of weapon to discredit political enemies, what you do find in the conclusion is historians using allegations of homosexual behavior to try to discredit, and most especially you lavish attention on David Donald and his treatment of Charles Sumner. And so I maybe want to just say this to sort of suggest that it's like, although we've mostly spent our time in the 19th century, the story really continues well into the 20th century and actually has as much to say about historians' production of, I think, a lot of what we take to, the assumptions that we have today about what we're going to find in the past are actually quite recent. They're not reflective of the actual sources of the 19th century.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's maybe a risky thing to talk about David Donald, Mississippi historian, but we'll do it. The claim at the end about David Donald is contrasting his approach to Lincoln versus his approach to Sumner. Donald has a Lincoln biography, but he also has a book called We Are Lincoln Men, Lincoln and His Friends, in which he's responding to the claims about Lincoln's homosexuality. And Donald pretty forcefully says, no, Lincoln's not homosexual. Had he been bisexual, he would have been a different person, one whose like inner conflict could never have allowed for his political success, is Donald's claim about Lincoln. He also has a biography of Charles Sumner. And in that biography of Charles Sumner, he has a footnote where he says, I haven't found an example of an overt homosexual relationship with Sumner, but the rest of the book lays it on pretty thick, his reading of Sumner as psychically impotent, as having an essentially feminine element, of Sumner as being, especially as the reviews pick up on it, Sumner being latent homosexual is his argument. So Donald has these two versions of 19th century political figures, one being Lincoln, one being Charles Sumner. Lincoln, though he says it's very common for men to have shared a bed, Lincoln was definitely not a homosexual. Sumner, though I have no example of Sumner's homosexuality, nonetheless, we can explain his politics through psychoanalytic theories of sexual repression. what's the difference for Donald between Lincoln and Sumner? It's that Sumner is a political radical. Sumner is a radical Republican and a lifelong abolitionist. Sumner wrote the Civil Rights Bill in 1874 that is a prototype, in many ways is the prototype for the 1964, 190 years early Civil Rights Act. Lincoln is a moderate. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about in the conclusion is how historians use the epistemologies, meaning the sort of ways of thinking about sexuality of their own period, to make these interpretive moves about the past. So Donald prefers Lincoln to Sumner because of Lincoln's moderate politics over Sumner's radical politics. The way that he renders that presentation is through a declaration of Lincoln's heterosexuality and a declaration of Sumner's inverted latent homosexuality. So I do think that, as I said before, with the Dunning School, situating them in the New York City environment, situating them in sexual science is one of the aims. But that is one of the things I'm trying to do in the book, is do a kind of Hayden White style reading of historical writing using the tools of queer studies, to say that we can read these historical narratives using the tools to understand sexual epistemologies and the differences between the way that a historian thinks about sexuality in their categories and the way that it's operable in its period.
So hopefully you all have gotten a sense of just how capacious this book is.
Some of the answers too capacious now.
Andy, this is a terrific, terrific book. I learned a lot, and it's just it's a romp through so many things. If you're interested in it, it is likely touched upon and it involves sort of the 19th century. It is likely somewhere in these 182 pages. So please get your hands on a copy. You too, I think, will learn a lot from Andy's incredible, prodigious work here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you again for being here. Thank you.